Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, because we're not quite at afternoon. Thank you so much, Mariam, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming today. And let me also extend my thanks to Alain for agreeing to be a discussant today. We'll have a conversation after my talk, and also to KIMEP for their support of my research and generous hosting this summer. What I'll be presenting today is new research and very much a work in progress, so I look forward to hearing your questions and comments, and much of this is the result of the research that I conducted while I was in Kazakhstan over this summer. So, everyone can hear me, yes? I think so. Okay, great. So let's begin here with this small pencil drawing. It's really very small. It's just 14 by 20 centimeters. So seeing it in this large image can be a little bit distorting. From 1953. It's of a wooden bridge spanning a very narrow river. And the bridge seems to have been assembled in a somewhat ad hoc fashion. It doesn't really inspire much confidence in its ability to carry a heavy load across the river. And just chatting with Alain, he was reminded of a bridge that collapsed, right? So this doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence. And this drawing itself wouldn't necessarily rank high among examples of drawings made in Kazakhstan in this period or any other time, though I think it's useful to launch an investigation of any artistic episode from some apparently marginal point of entry, and this is also part of my method. So we can begin by asking some things about this drawing. What is this a depiction of? Where is this, right? Who is the artist? And why would they choose to create this image in particular? The minimalism of this drawing, in some sense the kind of meagerness of its content, begins to be filled out by some details that are included on the image's verso, and I've put those here in the caption. The artist, Irina Borkman, titled the drawing Bridge Across the Batsuk, Road to Alexandrovka. The Batsuk refers to a river that runs for about 170 kilometers through central Kazakhstan, and it primarily serves farming areas. Alexandrovka, to the best of my knowledge, is a very small village in the Akmolinskaya Oblast, near another village called Zuralovka, which is a place that Irina Borkman, the artist, lived from 1951 to 1956. Borkman was an artist. She studied at an esteemed avant-garde art school, Kutamas, in Moscow in the 1920s. But she was arrested in 1941 in Frunze, formerly Bishkek, due to her ethnicity while she was working as a wartime painter of propaganda posters. And she was, because she was ethnic German, she was charged with espionage. Borkman is one of an estimated 5 million people who were arrested during the Stalinist terror and sentenced to forced labor in the region of Karaganda, known as Karlog, between 1931 and 1959. Karlog was one of the largest forced labor camp complexes of the Soviet Union. It extended across central Kazakhstan, covering an area roughly the size of France. And this is a map that's in a memorial museum in Dolinka. Is the pointer okay?
This way.
Oh.
No, the computer is there. So.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't want to. Oh, here? Am I shining?
That way.
Am I going to hit someone's eyes?
No.
Oh,
you need the...
Laser. Yeah.
Okay, the laser.
The laser. It's okay. I mean, you guys can see the map. I'll just use my hands, no problem. Karlog confined a remarkably diverse population. Political prisoners from across the Soviet Union, intellectuals, writers, artists, scientists were joined by peasants accused of resistance during collectivization, kulaks disposed of land in the early 1930s, and ordinary citizens who were swept up in Stalinist purges. During the war years, ethnic minorities labeled unreliable, so Volga Germans, Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Koreans, and many others were deported en masse to Kazakhstan, many ending up in Karlog. The camp's population also included women and children, often families of the accused. And this kind of heterogeneity distinguished Karlog. It was not solely a penal colony for criminals, but a vast machinery of repression that encompassed a spectrum of Soviet society. So this kind of enigmatic scene that Borkman made at the last location she was sent to work in agriculture on a sheep farm. So this is a kind of scene that encompassed her every day, and as in some ways unspectacular, as unremarkable as this image may be, really a kind of simple pencil drawing without any visible drama or any kind of indication of horrific atrocities that both she and this land experienced. The edges, nevertheless, of this paper, in essence, describe the parameters of her life at that time. And in another work that she made in 1951, in a place called Lisaya Gora, near another location before she was sent to the final place where she made the previous image, this depicts a kind of similarly hazy scene. We see a large tree that is filling out most of this drawing and is kind of blocking our view of the horizon. So we see a kind of thin horizon line, but not very clear. She calls this work Dreams of Trees. And to describe this place in her memoirs, she also uses a word that really captured my interest and will serve as our kind of conceptual point of entry for the talk today. She describes the area, the steppe, as pustinoi, as empty, right, as a kind of desert, not a single tree and scorching sun. So what's critical here is that Borkman is experiencing this place, the steppe, as a space of emptiness, right? A kind of desert that's defined by absence, right? By something that's not there, a lack of defining features, certainly not trees, which she would have been more familiar with from her home. Now, the steppe region of Kazakhstan is incredibly diverse. In fact, a site of vast vegetal and animal life, was home to nomadic and semi-nomadic Kazakh communities for centuries, as well as now urban dwellers and industries. So Borkman's use of this term desert, right, as a kind of wasteland and emptiness, needs some critical contextualization, both within her own biography, within also the history and art history of the Soviet Union, as well as the imperial period in what is now Kazakhstan, when this area was part of a Russian colony, Turkestan. And today I want to bring these images that Borkman made in dialogue with other images of the steppe, particularly in the Karaganda region, with which we may be more familiar. Paintings of the Virgin Lands campaign, of grain production, such as this one at the bottom, or of a steppe land that's sort of flourishing and almost romantic with a lone rider right atop these kind of grassy, sort of flowing, flourishing soils, and to kind of bring these images together, right? How is it possible that the steppe can be these images, as well as its antithesis, right? A road that is kind of leading to nowhere, that seems to sort of bewilder us and entrap us, right? Rather than open up for us. And I argue that beginning already in the early to mid-19th century, in order for the land of the steppe eventually to be imagined and remade as productive, for example, right? Like in these images, it has first to be imagined within a colonial discourse and with art as unproductive, right? So in the sense that, in essence, you can't claim to be fixing something if it isn't already broken, right? There needs to be a reason, right, to show that it is empty or that it's broken in order to be able to, quote unquote, fix it. So Borkman's images come later than some of the images of the 19th century that I'll show you today, but they're part of this bigger historical conceptualization of the steppe as vast and of empty. And to understand these different constructions, right, these different ways of thinking about the steppe, I adopt Lucy Lippard's distinction between land use and landscape. These are two important things to kind of keep in mind. Land use, when we talk about this, is actually a material practice of labor and of abstraction. How is the land actually being used at different moments in history? Whereas landscape, right, in Russian paysage, is a cultural construction that is actually framing the land as a way of seeing, as a kind of scenery. So these two, the way these two things relate is something I'm very interested in as an art historian. And in Kazakhstan, in its modern history, the steppe was, the steppe was both of these things, right? It was once imagined as landscape, but it was also mined, it was plowed, it was reconfigured through forced labor. Attempts really, in essence, almost to erase certain histories from the steppe in order to be filled with a kind of Soviet promise of modernity, right? And this process has been discussed in a lot of different literature. So I'm building, of course, on the work of other scholars who have looked at the forced resettlement of Kazakh populations by Russian imperial administration already in the late 19th century, ecological transformations of the steppe through agriculture, through mining operations, as well as horrific famine between 1930 and 1933 when nearly 2 million people died, the majority of which were ethnic Kazakhs. And then efforts to reform, right, to reimagine the land anew during the kind of post-Stalinist Virgin Lands campaign, right, when the steppe is sort of reimagined as something that is fresh and new and virgin. So we can sort of ask, right, what I'd like to do today, what is the relationship between such, in some ways, atrocities, right, and other ways, beauty in certain aspects of the landscape. And what I want to argue today, and in my larger project, is that each of these images, right, that I showed you or on the previous slide, are not the whole story in itself, right? Each image is part of the story of the steppe. And in thinking about the steppe as representation, it's of course integral to the construction of Kazakh and Kazakhstani identity, and the broader kind of political and social image of Kazakhstan from the early 19th century through the present. And so to kind of understand how these images of the steppe become meaningful, right, then and also now in public consciousness, we also have to bring back what was not in view, right, what was hidden. So the argument that I would like to put forth today is that while certain official imagery of the Soviet period emphasized the steppe transformation into a productive socialist landscape, or sometimes more romantic images of a nomadic past, repressed artists such as Borkman register land in a really different way, a different manner, as resistance to productivity, through rendering the land blank, enclosed, or silent. And this paper today is part of a larger chapter in my current book project about art, land, and the making of modern Kazakhstan. As Mariam mentioned, and I can say more about that in the discussion afterwards, but there I focus on the kind of oppositions that the steppe holds together: progress versus degradation or backwardness, confinement versus freedom, barrenness versus fertility, and hidden versus exposed. And here I also want to emphasize that the material that we're discussing today addresses histories of violence to land as well as to humans, and it's incredibly emotionally challenging material. And while the images themselves are not actually explicitly violent all the time, and in fact that kind of general silence is actually quite important, right, to our reading of them, and the way people negotiated relationships with their new environments. The historical period that we're kind of traversing was a time of almost unimaginable suffering in Kazakhstan. And histories of the Karaganda region are not only about settler colonialism, but also about pushing certain subjects kind of closer to the land. I'll talk about this today in kind of deeper relationship with it. And in the context of artworks by repressed artists, the relative difficulty of accessing the steppe and its kind of underground realms, the subterranean realms, became a means of symbolizing what could not be said openly, things about loss, about grief, about what author Elaine Scarry has called the deep subterranean fact of physical pain. And I'm building on really excellent scholarship by historians such as Aygul Amarov and Nurlan Dulebekov, and I also really want to thank the Karaganda Regional Museum of Art and their director, Bibigul Sagentaeva, and the head of collections as well. Many of the works that you'll see today are included in their collection of art, and they've been incredibly helpful in learning more about these artists, about which actually very little has been written so far. So what is the steppe? Where is it? These are themselves questions to which answers have varied over time. And prior to these more modern histories that we're looking at today, the steppe, as I said, was home to a diversity of life for thousands of years, an expanse of time which we, of course, don't have time to fully address today. And the period that I'm looking at with you all is a more recent one. The conception of the steppe in Kazakhstan as a vast expanse, empty, which actually long predated Borkman's image. From the 19th century onward, imperial administrators and artists framed the region as barren, as inhospitable, and in need of transformation. Transformation through agriculture and the arrival of geologists, of artists, military officials, naturalists, and also settlers, right, from the Russian Empire into this region, were striving to identify ecological conditions suitable for agriculture. So trying to understand where can agriculture take place. And this type of idea was not simply descriptive, right? By insisting on the steppe's lack of defining features, imperial discourse prepared the ground for its reconfiguration as a productive resource. So artists like this one, Artur Quinji, is a landscape painter, really is such an incredible illustration of the steppe being kind of abstracted, right, into a kind of boundless horizon, right? We don't see, almost no defining features. It's completely smooth, right? It's almost just two or three grains of color. So this is sort of the steppe imagined as an immense plain under a limitless sky, really stripped of definitely of human presence, any type of human activity, and very sort of just light vegetation. Just some further kind of contextualization. Such moves were not unique to Imperial Russia. In the United States, the kind of expansion, the conquering of the American West, U.S. surveyors, painters, photographers repeatedly depicted prairies and deserts as kind of idyllic wilderness that were awaiting the plow, erasing indigenous systems of land management, or depicting indigenous communities, such as here, as kind of primitive, part of a romantic former life, in order to justify the expansion of settler colonialism. And the British Empire similarly did the same. Landscapes across Ireland, India, different parts of Africa would be reclassified as wastelands when they didn't conform to English agricultural norms. So this kind of research is part of a broader history of the way empires saw land and saw colonies. And the art historian Vittoria De Palma has an excellent book about wastelands. She's shown the concept of wasteland is not merely ecological, but also epistemic, right? So that means a way of rendering land knowable, how we know the land, by denying its existing uses and inhabitants. So we can think of wastelanding almost as a kind of verb, right? It's a form of what we might call anticipatory architecture, a conceptual break that clears space, right, for colonial settlement and its ongoing sedimentations. Different technologies were also introduced in order to render Kazakh land into landscape typologies that were clearly legible to the state. So I spent a lot of time in archives this summer reading documents from the 1890s, from the 1920s, when you can really feel the colonial administration trying to assess where does the steppe end, where does it begin, where do the mountains end, where do they begin, in order to render that legible. So they use things like cartographic surveys, expeditions, visual training, and art academies also all kind of work together to transform the steppe into something that is measurable, that is reproducible. So we can think about mapping, just showing you some examples of maps here, the kind of grid lines, the data that is gathered, that could be planned, settled, and eventually mined. And so these survey maps, this is a much later one of the Karagundaries from 1981, but they kind of divide the territory, right, into parcels. And then it becomes coded with geological strata, right, and understandings of different mineral deposits. So what happens when you kind of make a grid is sort of a paradox, right? On the one hand, you claim to like reveal what is under the ground, right? Where it's like, I can now understand what's beneath, what I couldn't see before, while simultaneously also erasing the surface life, right? Everything else that's on top, that just sort of disappears, right? And all of a sudden becomes almost less important to that stuff that's underground, right? And so villages, right, nomadic routes, different kind of ecological systems, those things all start to change, become less important than that which is underground. And James Scott, sociologist, has called this state simplifications, representations not designed to kind of mirror any sort of reality, but actually to make the land legible, that you can read it administratively, you can map it, you can go to it, you can, of course, exploit it. So the kind of brokenness of the land that we start to see in the 20th century was actually not an accident, but was part of a much longer history in which land was fractured, divided, analyzed, before it could then be reconstituted in the Soviet socialist context. And colonial projects relied on this practice of kind of preemptive breaking and organizing everything into kind of easily understandable parts. Other works of art also kind of similarly emphasize the sense of vastness, of abstraction, right? So we're not getting a lot of details about the qualities of the steppe here. In this work by the Russian painter Ivashev-Musatov, the steppe is sort of a void, right, in which a carriage can kind of hurtle itself, right, endlessly. And such images would have been seen widely in imperial Russian exhibitions. They would have been reproduced and kind of affected then, in a sense, the perception of the steppe. So we have this abstraction, cartography. It's also important to mention photography as part of creating an image of a steppe. The French traveler Paul Labre, among many others, produced ethnographic photographs of Kazakh nomads in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Everyone was sort of labeled Kyrgyz broadly, though, so it elides the kind of ethnic specificity of the people who were photographed. And it's sometimes difficult to tell. Individuals would be sometimes they would be posed in a staged activity in these types of ethnographic photographs. Sometimes there would be actual aspects of daily life. But the way these photographs worked is they created a kind of typologies of nomadic life, presenting it as timeless, as a historical, in a sense, kind of passing away. And the historian Sarah Cameron, whose book I showed you in an earlier slide, has emphasized that such representations were profoundly misleading. That nomadism was not a kind of archaic vestige of some unsophisticated past, but actually a highly sophisticated ecological adaptation to real ecological conditions of the scarcity of water, of the climate, of the nature of the pasture lands and the steppe. And by erasing this adaptability, imperial and later Soviet representations really recast what was a complex environment into a blank canvas, right, for intervention. Another artist, this was a photograph that I took at an exhibition, so it's a little bit uneven, but this is an artist who we can see here in Almaty. Nikolai Khlyudov was based here in Almaty. This is a painting of grain gathering from 1910. Khlyudov was an artist and a geographer who participated in many Russian imperial exhibitions. He was a member of the Russian Imperial Geographic Society here in Almaty. And he goes on to teach. An artist who we know very well here in Almaty, Abdulkhan Kasteyev, was his student in the Soviet period. Khlyudov used ethnographic photographs to make his paintings. He would paint based on photographs such as the ones I just showed you. And in this painting, I'm really interested in the relationship that he depicts between Kazakh or Kyrgyz workers and the land. The sense that they're actually touching the grain, right? That their hands are in the grain, very close to the ground, right? They're the ones who are being presented as having a very intimate relationship with the land. because in other parts of my book, which I won't have as much time to get into today, but in other types of images, it's really important, I've noticed, to see how different types of technologies, like a camera, like a measuring stick, these types of objects used to read the land, right, to measure it, how those also register and bridge distances between people, between those who are, in some sense, coming from the outside and those who are considered to be indigenous to a place. So here we see these two young women who are holding these, like a pointing stick, other types of measuring, charting devices, right? So they're not touching the land per se, right? They're sort of being framed as outsiders who are arriving in the steppe, whereas others are actually pressed closer to the ground. And this is relevant because in images it serves to kind of construct certain racial and social hierarchies, right? Those who are seen as more civilized may be constructed then as using different types of technologies, right? But from the outside. So this is just kind of something that I've become interested in, paying attention to how technologies are represented, right? And in relationship with the land. And I can show you a few more examples of this. But we see this even in other types of artwork. So this is a very early drawing by Kasteyev from 1932. This is depicting the arrival of the Turk Sib. We see this locomotive kind of cutting into our space, right? And its tracks are kind of forming this, this big sweep, this open corridor. And what is it literally cutting off the path of? Right? It's cutting off the path of, presumably, right, a kind of general type of a nomad, right, in this path. So even in this, really, again, it can be easily kind of skirted past as just, like a drawing of the Turk Sib, right? There's a very clear narrative here that's linked to the land and who gets to move, right, and who doesn't, right? Who's moving in whose path. So this line of progress versus nomadism being framed as kind of the thing that's being stopped. So we have these visual strategies of mapping, of perspectives, photography, and all kind of working to kind of claim and measure this aesthetic of expansiveness that begins in the 19th century and is kind of celebrated later in socialist realist paintings. So if the paintings I've just shown now and maps make the steppe legible from above, the industrial region of Karaganda demanded that it also be remade right from below, from the underground. And in the 1930s, Karaganda was becoming the kind of expanding epicenter of the Soviet regime's mining industry. Maybe some of you are even from Karaganda here. And following Donbass. So a lot of the coal industry previously was located in Donbass, where it actually still is, and then this kind of grows into the Karaganda region. And again, what's kind of important for my work is the way that this region was depicted, that there's a kind of striking asymmetry. While actually everyone went to Karaganda for what was underground, the images that we see are not of the underground. Most of the paintings are of the things that happened above ground, of fields, of factories, railways, smokestacks, right, like this one. And this imbalance in representation also appears in literature. We can find it in a very early novel, this one here called Karaganda by Gabidin Mustafin. He describes Karaganda as, this is from 1941, as a kind of decrepit area, awaiting resurrection. So the narrative of the story is about migrants arriving specifically from Donbass to the Karaganda region, and those migrants were recast as sort of agents of arrival, that their labor was imagined as kind of breathing life into a dead land. And so one quote is «Мы поможем казахскому народу разбудить для жизни широкий степь», right? So to awaken it. So again, this narrative, right, of a land that was dead that then needs to be awakened through the arrival of someone from outside. And these narratives really extended this colonial logic that was already there in the 19th century. Of course, within the region, indigenous Kazakhs had already understood and found coal prior to the Soviet period, but that's not a part of this narrative, right? We need the narrative in the sense of something that is barren, that is decrepit, in order to legitimate, right, that which is new. And visual production also reinforced this idea. Paintings of Karaganda from the 1950s emphasized above-ground productivity. A typical composition might feature sort of vast fields dotted with combine harvesters, or in this particular image, right, white, presumably Slavic settlers in the Virgin Lands campaign, right, digging into the ground. Again, here note that they're not reaching it with, they are standing in the soil, but they're not touching it with their hands. They have these sticks, right? And this is part of this mediation, right? That a tool is needed in order to touch this foreign land, this virgin land. And we have, the kind of steam and clouds pouring into the sky. But we can also look at this work by Vladimir Eifert, which is roughly contemporaneous with those other two images from 1961. Eifert was a repressed artist who was also imprisoned in Karlog and made many paintings. This is one he made after he was released. His images of this is a painting of miners going to work, are really quite different than some of the others that we see. Here we see, well, what we don't see are faces, right? Largely anonymous figures. And the emphasis is not necessarily on production really at all, but on this process of entry, right? Kind of silhouetted against a kind of barren, right, snowscape. And so at this edge between visibility, between disappearance, of course this type of labor was punishing, right, very difficult, exposed to toxic dust, and really unrelenting physical strain. So he even sort of positions us a little bit below the canvas, so we feel also like that we are lower in this process of kind of moving with them. And again, these paintings are roughly contemporaneous, right? So almost made at the same time, but very different perspectives, right, of this region. And in some sense, this is the kind of dual nature of abstraction. It's not just the removal of resources, but also, right, a subjugation of bodies. And to press to mind was to press human life closer to the earth. Some would stand above, some people get to stand above the earth, right, to look out at the horizon in a social hierarchy. Others are driven beneath into the mine. And this is all part of this kind of spectacle of surface productivity in a kind of racialized geology where certain groups are allowed to be present, right, to be productive, while others are not. So again, the interest in what can be depicted on the surface, what is not shown in the subterranean realm. And here I'd like to just show another image within this framework. This is a painting by an artist named Lev Primerov, who also had some artistic training in Moscow. He was arrested in 1937, first sentenced to forced labor in Ukhta in the Komi Republic, and then in 1949 is sent to Karlog. This is a painting he made after his release in 1952. This is not a painting of the steppe per se, though he made this painting while he was still living in Karaganda, living in the steppe region. The original title of the painting I put here was Daroga, so he just called it Road. Now it's been retitled as Ukhta, which I think is a reference probably to this more type of forested landscape that one would have seen in the Komi Republic, though I kind of like the title, I prefer the title Daroga, the road, because it gives it a kind of non-place, right? And I think for me this is a painting that is about something much more imprecise. The land here is really important to pay attention to, this kind of murky swampland, right, that is inaccessible, that where nothing can grow, right? We see these birch trees, which, in late 19th century painting would have symbolized Russia, would have symbolized home. I think this would not have been lost on Lev Primirov to depict birch trees, right, in this kind of state of, almost collapsing. Again, here, like with Borkman's work, we have this long road that seems to lead nowhere, so the sense of enclosure, and the land itself, it just seems to be kind of decaying in some way, right? An uncertain space that's almost perhaps absorbing the pain and yet yields no kind of stability. This painting was exhibited in Karaganda in 1962. This was one of the few, if only, times that Primirov's work was actually exhibited. Because even if you were a repressed artist imprisoned, even when you were released, you still had the burden, right, of your previous crimes that were sort of followed with you, and you would not have had as many opportunities, if any opportunities at all. And in the memoirs of a writer named Yuri Gert, he actually saw this work at an exhibition and described it. He said, landscape, this is not just a landscape. This was his life, imagined on canvas and painting. So, right, a sense that, right, this is not just, right, depicting a place, not just a view, but really a life. And then the final figure I want to introduce is Sergei Ivashev-Musatov. Adds a kind of inflection to this kind of series of counter images of the steppe that I'm providing. Ivashev-Musatov also studied in Moscow, and he was also a mathematician. He studied art, and he was a mathematician. He was arrested in 1947 in connection with the case, someone else's case, and was accused of counter-revolutionary sentiments during the war, and arrives in Karlog in 1948. His works are a bit kind of dreamier in a certain sense, especially this undated charcoal drawing on the right, but also circumscribed, because they depict a place, maybe an imagined place, a kind of circumscribed place with which he could move, right? So even though, again, we think about these kind of paintings as, oh, this is, it's just a tree or it's just a hill, the fact that, right, this land doesn't really lead anywhere, it's a kind of upfront, closed territory, was really dramatically different than the other types of images that we've seen of the steppe, which is so expansive, right, and so open to access. So taken together, I think these artists begin to provide a kind of counter view of the Soviet state's construction of the steppe as infinite and workable. And I see them as part of a broader history that questions the colonial hierarchy of land and of bodies, of those of laborers, of prisoners or exiles who were pressed closer to the ground. Their proximity to the earth was not choice, but a condition of oppression, where physical toil collapses the romantic expanse of the steppe into a kind of claustrophobic, uncertain enclosure. So land is both kind of medium and it's also the witness. But to sort of end the story here would also, I think, be to kind of risk reproducing the binary, right, that the state itself reproduced between either barren kind of emptiness or oppressive enclosure. And it's precisely that impasse that many contemporary artists working in Kazakhstan have inherited, but also have now worked to overcome. And by way of conclusion, I offer Almagul Minobayeva's multimedia works, such as her film Transoxiana Dreams, which focuses on ecological disaster more in the Aral Sea, or her film Archipelago Karlag, which kind of refused to portray the steppe as either one. She's an art, you can see her, I brought her in because, her work in because you can see her retrospective, which is just opened at the Almaty Museum of Arts. You can see this in more detail, but she situates figures, often women, in environments that have been marked by ecological degradation, and And the interest here is that she and many other contemporary artists are now trying to kind of re-language, we could say, the steppe, right? Not to simply just rehearse trauma endlessly, but also not to kind of continue to resurrect these typical grammars, right, that we've seen over the past few hundred years, to really think about the steppe as an active agent, right, not something that is passive, but that the land itself, right, is connecting with people and open to new forms of imagination and habitation. So I leave us with these images by way of conclusion. I think I've spoken just about long enough so we can move to the conversation. Thank you so much for your attention.